This video is called Principles and Operations. We're going to start with what we call the commutative principles. Commutative, or commute, means to change locations. We're going to talk about the commutative principle when it applies to addition and when it applies to multiplication. So, the commutative principle for addition is about changing locations of variables or numbers when doing addition. So for all real numbers x and all real numbers y, I can take x and add it to y, and that should be equal to taking y and adding it to x. So I've changed the location of my variables, and this should be true. Let's try it with numbers. Let's say x equals 3 and y equals 4. So 3 plus 4 should be equal to 4 plus 3. So I've substituted here now. 3 plus 4 is 7, which equals 7. And this is true. And this is what we call the commutative principle for addition. Now let's look at the commutative principle for multiplication. If I take all real numbers for x and all real numbers for y, this should be true. If I multiply x times y, that should give me the same answer, or the same result, as y times x. This time let's say x equals 2 and y equals 6. So that means that 2 times 6 should be equal to 6 times 2. 12 equals 12, so this is true. And those are both commutative principles. It's all about variables and numbers changing location. So changing location. And in both of these examples, that's what happens. Now let's look at the associative principles. Let's take this word here, associate. Well, when you talk about associating, it means to group together. So we're going to talk about the association of variables and numbers in addition and in multiplication. So for all real numbers for x, all real numbers for y, and all real numbers for z, so we're going to use 3 variables here, this should be true. If I take x and I add y to it, and then I take that and add z to it, I should get the same result if I take x and add to it y plus z. Notice here that the grouping symbols have changed. In one I'm grouping x and y, and the other I'm grouping y and z. The variables have not changed location, just the grouping symbols. So if x equals 2, y equals 3, and z equals 4, let's test this out. So I have 2 plus 3. I'm going to group that here because I want to follow the pattern exactly, plus 4. That should equal 2 plus 3 plus 4. Again, the numbers are all in the same order, but I've grouped them differently. 2 plus 3 is 5. If I add 4, I get 9. 3 plus 4 is 7. If I add 2, I also get 9, which is equal. So this is true. That's the associative principle of addition. I'm changing how the variables or the numbers are associating. Now let's look at the associative principle for multiplication. Again, I'm going to use real numbers for x, y, and z. If I take x, y, z and multiply them, I'm going to multiply x and y first and then z. What should also be true is if I take x and multiply it by the solution or the product of y and z. So again, let's try x equals 2, y equals 3, and z equals 4. So 2 times 3 times 4 should be equal to 2 times the product of 3 times 4. Let's test it out. 2 times 3 is 6, times 4 is 24. That should be equal to 2 times 3 times 4 is 12, or 24. Those are equal, so this would be true. So this is the associative principles for addition and multiplication. I can change how I group my numbers, as long as I've got all addition or all multiplication. This is something that I should be able to do. Now I'd like to review two other principles that we've already talked about. The identity principles, which you'll find in the other principles part of your purple packet. These are called identity principles. The principle of multiplying by positive 1 uses the multiplicative identity of 1. It means anytime I multiply something by 1, it continues to have the same identity. The PA0, our principle for adding 0, uses the additive identity, or 0, because anything I add to 0 leaves me with the identity of the number. So let's look at these two principles. Let's start with the principle of multiplying by positive 1. For all real numbers that I use for x, this should be true. X times positive 1 should give me x. Well, let's say x equals 5. 5 times positive 1 equals 5. Well, 5 equals 5, so this is true. Now let's look at the principle for adding 0. For all real numbers for x, this should be true. If I take x and I add 0 to it, I should get x. Let's say that x equals 3. 3 plus 0 equals 3. So 3 equals 3, which is true. And that's the principle for adding 0. This is the end of the video on principles and operations.